And at the time of admission to the ER, I believe my blood sugar was 980. It was up there. The doctor made a comment that most people don't walk in with that kind of blood sugar. They usually come in on gurneys. But my wife and I both ate what we thought was healthy at the time. And I guess by comparison to a standard American diet, it was. We stayed away from a lot of the heavily processed foods and junk foods and that kind of stuff. But we still did eat sugary things. My claim to fame is my affinity for these Chex Mix things that are called Muddy Buddies that are basically Chex Mix covered in sugar. I told a member of Congress, I said, hey, yeah, if you want me to show up in front of the White House with a green tutu on and walk backwards, just tell me when and where and what time. I'm there. We just want some rules, and that's what we work towards. Dr. Richard Bernstein, of course, his book was the first full book that I read that really gave validity to some things that I had heard and had seen and practiced on my own. No fault of our parents. They didn't know any better. They were doing what they were, recommended to do by doctors. But the reason why I bring this up is in the last year, 3 of my friends that I went to high school with have all died from massive heart attacks.
Okay, we're recording. Awesome. John, welcome. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate you being here today. So, John, for those that aren't familiar with you, would you just give us a little bit of your background if you're okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just got in contact with you regarding diet, nutrition, lifestyle as it applies to the return to my present career of a professional airline pilot, and just wanted to get a little bit more information out there and kind of a personal take on how things have improved my life and also enabled me to return back to my career utilizing a very low carbohydrate diet and going against the normal recommendations that the ADA is currently still impressing upon type 1 and type 2 diabetics.
So I guess background, you're type 1 diabetic, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I was diagnosed, when I was 36 years old, pretty late in life, and really no prior family history to it. I was very active with mountain bike racing, lifting weights, numerous other activities. So, of course, the diagnosis came as a very big shock. And then, of course, my given career requires me to hold a medical certification in addition to my certification as various levels of pilot certifications, which the medical certification allows me to exercise the privileges of the pilot certificate. So without one, you can't practice the other. And at the time, diagnosis of not just type 1, but any insulin-treated diabetes was an immediate disqualifying for holding a first-class medical that is required for commercial aviation.
Yeah, and you said commercial aviation, so you fly. Do you mind, can you share what you fly or who you fly for? Or is that?
No, that's fine. So at the time, I was working for a regional carrier, was my career track all the way through. I actually got my private pilot's license, which is the first level of pilot certification, when I was 16 years old, and then went into collegiate aviation, and then also did a minor in kinesiology and physiology while I was at Ohio State University. And I flew cargo for a number of years, 2 years to get experience and just the background that was required at the time to move into commercial aviation. And then I worked for 2 regional companies, the last of which was SkyWest Airlines, and I was an instructor there and captain flying 70 and 90 seat regional jets. And at that time was when I was diagnosed with type 1. And that was basically an end to that, so to speak. I was able to retain my position as an instructor in the ground simulators. So everything that basically didn't fly, I was able to teach on, and I was able to retain that position while I worked in conjunction with many other people to advance the advent of a new protocol through the Federal Aviation Administration to allow for what's called a special issuance first-class medical, which under specific guidance of that protocol allowed myself and many others to get back to their aviation career. And after I was able to return back to flying at the regional, I then also submitted to become employed by a major airline. I now work for United Airlines, flying the Airbus A320 variant of aircraft.
So that's very interesting, because I didn't realize, because I would have assumed, a type 1 diabetic on insulin would be disqualified because of, and we can
Right.
talk about potential issues and we can go into that. But let me go back to your diagnosis. So you were how old and how did that come about? What happened that propelled you into getting diagnosed?
So I was 36 years old, and at the time I had really no prior medical issues. As a commercial airline pilot, under the age of 40, you go in every year for what's called a first class medical exam, not dissimilar to some of the flight physicals that you probably were familiar with in the Air Force, doctor. But those are surface level at best. And the reason why I could say that with great confidence is that a month prior to my diagnosis as type 1, I had just had a first class medical. In the urine testing, they're basically looking for significant protein dumping, drug scanning, that kind of thing. But they're really not looking for any of the other markers that might indicate diabetes, unless, of course, you have some significant dysregulation of your blood pressure or your eyes. And the reason why I bring up the eyes is that prior to my diagnosis, I had for about a month prior was starting to have some issues with seeing things at great distances. I had been stable with my eyes for 20 years. I wear contacts, but the prescription hadn't changed, and all of a sudden it started to change. And in conjunction with that, I started to have pretty significant weight loss, as well as a competitive mountain biker at the time. I sat pretty comfortably around 165, 170 pounds, pretty stable, fat mass, that type of stuff. But all of a sudden I started to just lose weight. And, at time of diagnosis, I was just under 150 pounds. So I shed about 20 plus pounds, which I didn't really have to lose. And that combined with the extreme fatigue and thirst, and mainly the fatigue, is what ultimately, prompted myself to call off for a trip that I was supposed to report for. And the morning of, my wife actually got back from doing a night shift of her own. She's a veterinarian, and she just flat out said, "No, you're not just calling off sick for that trip. We're going to the ER right now." And when I went into the emergency room, told them what my symptoms were, they actually came out and did a finger stick. And most finger stick glucometers will only read up to 450 milligrams per deciliter on your blood glucose. And they stuck mine, and it just read high, which means it was off the charts. And they immediately took me back and started trying to treat me for that. And at the time of admission to the ER, I believe my blood sugar was 980. So it was up there. The doctor made a comment that most people don't walk in with that kind of blood sugar. They usually come in on gurneys. So it was definitely a big shock. And of course, being a pilot, knowing that things like this could potentially affect my medical, it's the first thing I went to once I got through the initial rigmarole of getting into the ER. Looked it up on the FAA website, and there it was in bold print. Insulin-treated diabetes is a disqualifying event for a first-class medical. And along with dealing with the kind of shock of that situation, you also potentially see your career evaporate, which was a big shock.
Yeah, it's a double whammy, not only your career, but obviously your health. And so when you went in, you were diagnosed in the ER. How did I'm sure they hit you with some IV insulin to bring that down right away, and then gave you the spiel about insulin what was the device you were given essentially at that point?
I spent a couple days in the hospital, one in ICU and whatnot, mainly because of, at the time of diagnosis, you're effectively in diabetic ketoacidosis, which, as of course, being a physician, you are well versed on that, is mainly a extreme electrolyte imbalance that kind of puts your organ function at threat. And once they stabilize after that, they start talking about insulin and what it is. And I don't know if it's how common it is. I've talked to other friends of mine that are also type 1s, and some of which have gotten diagnosed very late. And it seems to be that, especially if you're an adult, there maybe is a lot of assumption on the part of the medical system that you're just going to grasp it. You just need to hear it once and off you go. And I was actually looking back at it. At the time, you're ignorant to what all is involved, but how quickly I was discharged. I was out of the hospital 3 days with a prescription for Lantus injection, which is a long-term or basal insulin. And I think they put me on Humalog as my rapid acting, again with a prescription for a insulin pen. They told me to pick up a blood glucose monitor, just finger stick blood glucose monitor at the pharmacy while I'm grabbing my other prescriptions, and made an appointment at the endocrinologist the next week, and that was about it. So it was abrupt, and there was at that time CGM, continuous glucose monitors, were being utilized. The current reiteration I'm on right now is I use a Dexcom G7. At the time it was Dexcom G4, so it was 3 full reiterations ago. But that was not commonplace. That was not even brought up until I was at my endocrinologist on the second visit or so as an option. And as soon as she described it and explained it to me, I was like, absolutely. I absolutely want one of those. But prior to that, it was all just finger sticks. So I was going old school by today's standards with pens and finger stick measurements.
So prior to your diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, you said you were pretty active and kind of athletic, mountain biking and whatnot. Diet was what? What was the diet like back then?
I would say it was maybe quintessential athlete. You could probably get away with a lot of shenanigans because of the activity level, as far as what you're eating, when you're eating, that kind of stuff. We were definitely gluten-free at the time because my sister had been diagnosed with a pretty significant gluten intolerance, and so we had gotten rid of that, but definitely not low carb by any stretch. But my wife and I both ate what we thought was healthy at the time, and I guess by comparison to a standard American diet, it was. We stayed away from a lot of the heavily processed foods and junk foods and that kind of stuff, but we still did eat sugary things. My claim to fame is my affinity for these Chex Mix things that are called Muddy Buddies, that are basically Chex Mix covered in sugar. I used to eat those around mountain bike races. But yeah, prior to diagnosis, it's one of those things where at the time, if your body composition is good and your activity level is good and you're feeling generally okay, you don't have necessarily a catalyst to make a change. But obviously, this diagnosis forced me to, my mindset is always, what's the cause? And as I started to research the antagonist, if you want to, of diabetes as a whole, that seemed to be carbohydrate. And the more volatile the carbohydrates, the more volatile it would make the disease. So that's where I started down the road of looking at low carb nutrition.
So the advice you were given by your endocrinologist, did they have any dietary advice, or was it just dose appropriately for your carbs? What was the advice you were given?
Yeah, so the endocrinologist that I'm still working with, and she does an excellent job of helping, particularly with the paperwork obstacles required by the FAA, was they send you to a diabetes educator, a certified diabetes educator. And I sat in on the first meeting with them, and all in good intention, but everything was pertained around serving and portion size of standard American diet items. So here's how much of these potato chips equal this many carbs, and here's how many servings of whatever. It's just standard items that you'd find in a grocery store. And then also with a pretty deliberate warning against eating too much protein, because that was a strain on the liver and kidneys more specifically. And I just, that none of that made sense, because I did have a little bit of nutritional base training from when I was in college, and that just didn't make sense. And the more I looked into it, it just didn't seem to jive with what the real science seemed to indicate. And of course, in the last 8 years, there's been quite the advent of the entire space that we're even talking on right now. It's been a huge benefit if people can find the information. That was one of the goals, and I really appreciate you having me on, is just to try and get more real life example and testament to say this stuff works, it's safe, it's good for your health, and it can help manage these significant lifelong diseases in a very positive way.
So you'd mentioned that, just for the people that may not understand what's going on here, that insulin treated diabetes is a disqualifying diagnosis, or has been. Mm-hmm. Why was that? What were the concerns about that as it pertains to flying a plane? Some of it might be obvious to other people. For those people that don't know, what would be the concerns?
Yeah, so the Federal Aviation Administration's main concern was the risk of hypoglycemia, right? Low blood sugar, which is on the acute scale, can provide, along with just generally, quote unquote, not feeling good, cognitive impairment, and if unchecked or untreated, could even lead to incapacitation. And that's on the acute scale, which is their primary concern. The high blood glucose was not I guess, as much of a concern, because in the short term, as you've talked about, and you've had many people who have quite the expertise beyond mine, have talked about the hyper or the high blood glucose is more of a long-term issue. But the Federal Aviation was mainly concerned with that hypo, potential for low blood glucose in the flight deck, and potentially you're not recognizing it, and that impairing your ability to act in real time. So as a pilot, or even while driving, to put it more on a layman scale, you don't really, you can't have that impairment. And especially when you're talking about a commercial airline pilot, when I have anywhere from 120 to 220 people sitting behind me, I'm sure every one of those people want to make sure that I'm not impaired either. So that was their main prohibition of that. But with that, they weren't, when I got involved in the advocacy, they were just getting introduced to the technology of continuous glucose monitor. And the CGMs were really what kind of put us over the goalpost, so to speak, or got us into the end zone, because that gives you the ability to have not only the ability to look at your blood glucose in real time and identify your trend toward a high, or more importantly, a low, but it has alerts itself. It's all self-contained. And that was really, by providing that was what enabled us, the folks that worked on this, to finally convince the FAA, and also a change in the Federal Air Surgeon, who was more willing to look at the current data and was more of a clinician rather than just an MD by paper. No offense to you, doctor, someone who basically went through the steps but never really saw patients, and so they didn't really have a grasp of bedside manner and how this affects people's lives. And with this combination of items, finally allowed us to say, look, here's the data. It's safe. What are the parameters that you want us to adhere to? That's all we're asking. However restrictive they may be, we just want the rules. And as rule followers, as commercial aviation, we'll follow those. I told a member of Congress, I said, hey, if you want me to show up in front of the White House with a green tutu on and walk backwards, just tell me when and where and what time. I'm there. We just want some rules, and that's what we work towards.
Obviously, you made the transition to a lower carb approach at some point during the diabetes diagnosis. Was there a period of time when you weren't, or was it almost immediately? You said, I got diagnosis and immediately I dropped carbs out, or how did that transition work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It was a process of almost elimination, because I had to do a lot of self-education on the disease, and very quickly, through doing some online training modules that basically a type 1 coach I had put together. He actually is based out of Australia and was a triathlete, and is a triathlete, I should say. The modules are very informative and actually went into a lot of physiology. And through reading that and going through that, it became very apparent that carbohydrates were the main antagonist. And so my mind worked in the manner of, let's see what happens if I have less of this antagonist, right? Let's say, it's the old party analogy. Somebody knows that one guy that shows up at the party, and it's fine until that one guy shows up. I'm like, that seems to be carbohydrates in this case. I started with breakfast and said, okay, instead of having 2 gluten-free waffles with my eggs and sausage, how about I just have 1? Oh, look at that. It takes less insulin and then less of a spike. And I said, well, let's just remove those waffles altogether. Hey, look at that. I use even less insulin and almost no spike. And I just parlayed that into other aspects. And then, of course, figuring out how to regulate insulin timing and dosing versus activity was another level to that still. And then, of course, working all that and managing that to maintain not just what would be considered by the current ADA standards of a 7 A1C. I said, that's still well into the diabetic range, and that doesn't seem like it would be beneficial for long-term health through minimizing carbohydrates and getting away from processed foods. That enabled me to basically, at time of diagnosis, my A1C was 13.1. And within 6 months, I had it down below 6 by removing all those carbohydrates. So that there's not a drug in the world that's going to do that, including insulin, right?
Yeah, for sure. Let me ask you about, so what are the rules now? Because now you got a CGM. Now you can go back to fly a commercial plane. Is there some sort of, you have to demonstrate a month worth of, how do they know you're controlled? Do you have to submit your CGM data before you fly, or how does that work now?
Yeah, so it's very rigorous, and it's been changed a number of times and updated based upon our feedback and some other physicians that have been involved with this push to get the protocol put in. And The kind of rundown of what they're looking for as purely from a blood glucose standpoint, I've actually got those here, so I can just read them off to you. They want your coefficient of variation, which is an indicator of how much you're fluctuating, to be below 33%, which if you're not diabetic, that really doesn't mean a whole lot. But they want you basically to have an A1C below 6.5. They'll consider some excursions above that. They want your glucose readings that are less than 54 milligrams per deciliter to be less than 1% of the time. And by percentages, they mean of the CGM data that you have to submit. And I'll get to that in a second. They want your glucose readings less than 70 milligrams per deciliter to be less than 4% of the time. They want your greater than 250 milligram per deciliter to be less than 5% of the time. And overall glucose readings between 70 and 250, which the high end is, again, not a focal point for them, has to be greater than 90% of the time. And you have to have a sensor wear time, meaning you have to be on a CGM for a minimum of 90% of the time. So they want you to be on a CGM. All this is predicated off of CGM data. I have to submit all of that. So every 6 months, I have to put in a monthly, what's called a AGP report, but a report of all my CGM data to show my compliance that I fall within those parameters. And if you fall outside of one of those parameters for any month, is an immediate revocation of your medical. You also have to go to a cardiologist once a year and have a full stress test done. You have to go to a ophthalmologist to have a full eye exam done. You have to have every 3 months, you have to have full blood work done. So we can talk about that as far as how this lifestyle affects blood work, because I have it done full blood panel every 3 months by mandate. And you have to have endocrinologist visits every 3 months to certify that you're managing the disease properly, you're well controlled, you're not having hypo or low blood glucose events, you're not having highs, and a number of other parameters. But it's an extensive amount of stuff. Every 6 months, I'm submitting about 120 pages of medical records into the FAA. So it's extensive. When this first came about, and I was one of the first to get approval of this, and since there's been over 250 people that have either returned to work or been able to or begin a career in aviation, there were people in even the type 1 community that were like, I'd never fly in an airplane with a type 1 pilot. That's unsafe. I can't imagine that. And rather than getting angry at that, it's more of a try and have a sense of compassion to say, it's possible. What can we do to educate you? Which, again, people like yourself are doing a great service there to give you that stability to make it safe.
So let me your diet as it currently looks, what is it?
I would say it's about 80% meat-based. There's higher protein for sure. Occasionally, because of my disease, I am forced to use like a glucose tab once in a while to stabilize a falling blood sugar. But the type and the amount of insulin that I use is what gives me the stability. And I'll eat some vegetables here and there if I have a hankering for them, but nuts here and there once in a while. But I would say about 80% meat-based and very low carbohydrate. I would say definitely stay below 80. If I'm flying or not very active, I stay below about 50 grams of carbohydrates a day. Maybe if I'm out on a huge mountain bike ride and I'm on the mountain bike for 4 hours at a time, I might need a little bit more. And a lot of times the resultant of that, or the cause of that, has to do with the basal insulin that I'm required to take. My body doesn't have the luxury of being able to turn off insulin when it's not needed. So you either have to have it or you don't with the basal insulin, because I do use injectable basal bolus, or what's called MDI, multiple daily injections. Some other people that I know use a pump, and that gives you some additional flexibility there. But I found from my own use, being very active with a varying degree of activity from day to day, having that short-acting insulin on board, even with a pump, which administers it in very tiny doses, that can be a little bit more volatile than I want to deal with, where that basal insulin is much more predictable.
Yeah, that's one of the things that you look at somebody on a low carb diet, and often it's the majority of the insulin they're consuming is basal, and they need less of the rapid acting because the meal doesn't tend to perturb it as much. Whereas somebody's on a high carb diet, it's almost the opposite, where the basal becomes a small amount, and then they're constantly mega dosing the rapid acting to account for all the carbohydrates, and they tend to be very often. That's one of the things that Dave Dykman talks about. It's very hard to catch carbs with rapid acting insulin because it's just, you got to hit it right on the money, and you're not often there, and often you end up with highs and lows. And so there's these rapid excursions, which is are problematic just for life, but also for flying. I assume like when you're flying, you've got to have some glucose tabs in the cockpit with you because in case you start feeling it going down, you got to correct that ahead of time. And let me ask you this. So as far as one of the things I see, because I know a lot of type 1 diabetics and type 2 diabetics with insulin using a low carb keto and carnivore diets.
Yeah.
And one of the things, they often run low. They just run low and they're on ketones and they feel pretty good. And, like you said, 70, a lot of people are fine in the 60s, but it's kind of one of those things where there's a guy named Cahill who did some studies on fasting, had people in the 20s and they were totally with it. So it's interesting that you might be comfortable in the 60, but because you want to minimize that time under 70 to keep your license, you probably have to eat a little bit more carbohydrates. And do you think the carbohydrates are there to keep you out of the 60s and 50s, or is it more just you just like eating them, or what are your thoughts on that?
I would say to address that, the 70 is just where the general powers that be came up with that number, because again, they're still having to look at what the ADA recommends, right? That's where they get that 70 to 180, right? And now the idea of time and tight range, 70 to 140, but that lower end is assuming your average person, right? I think even someone eating a fairly healthy diet with 150 grams of carbohydrates in their diet, if you stuck them down at 60 milligrams per deciliter, they may not feel good. And once you get fat adapted and you're ketogenic or carnivore, you'd be perfectly fine there. But to answer your question, I can make a significant difference in what my base blood glucose is by manipulating my basal insulin, right? So again, my body makes none. So let's say if I'm maybe have a day where I know I'm going to be active, I use a basal insulin called Revero, which has about a 14 to 18 hour action time. And I say, I think today, we're going to go for a mountain bike ride, or I'm going to go and do a big lifting session. I might take 8 units of basal insulin, and that will keep me away from those lows. Whereas if I know I'm just going to have a really big day in the airplane and we're going to be out flying for 10 hours, and relatively sedentary, I might take 12 units of insulin. So you can do a lot with your blood glucose by simply manipulating that basal insulin, and that goes to a non-diabetic to say, if your fasting insulin level, like what Dr. Ben Bigman talks about, is at 25, that's what your body's used to. Whereas like you get rid of that antagonist or the higher carb regime, and now you're at 5 and you're totally stable, right? So, as far as utilizing the carbohydrates, that will maybe sometimes be utilized around activities, or just quite frankly, and Artie Dykman's son talked about it, and so did he on your podcast, if I remember, where sometimes at night, that's a big struggle for type 1s because you can't take that out. You might need to eat some fat, or you might have to take a sip of juice or something. But again, with the low carbohydrate approach or a carnivore approach, you're talking about taking grams, 1, 2, 3, 4 grams, not, oh my God, I'm crashing, I need to go down and eat the refrigerator. It's just not, you don't have to do it because you're not fighting this. I don't want to be dramatic, but it's a lethal medication. You overdose on that stuff, and that's bad news.
Yeah. You could, with an insulin pen, you could easily kill somebody. You just give them, whack them in with 20 units of insulin. They're naive to it, and you could seriously put them down. Not giving anybody any ideas.
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But so do you mind sharing your weight, your body weight? So what is your basal amount versus your body? Because it's a 14-hour 11-hour, so you're probably dosing twice a day, I assume, with that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and again, you've had him on as well, Dr. Richard Bernstein, of course. His book was the first full book that I read that really gave validity to some things that I had heard and had seen and practiced on my own. And basically, I can attest to the fact that everything that man has put in that book is 100% true and accurate. It is not opinion. It is not what have you. So that's what I based a lot of my initial stuff off of. So I'm 6'2", and right now I'm sitting at about 173 pounds, about 9% body fat, maybe 10% body fat or so. I lift about 3 days a week. Again, my schedule flying and stuff kind of dictates that a little bit. If I miss a day, I just get it the next day. Ride a few days a week, do some hiking, backpacking, that kind of stuff. And at my normal activity level, I take usually about 12 units of Levemir in the morning, and then 1 to 2 units at night. And then at night, I try and make it a point not to eat within about 2 hours of going to bed. And then Another thing that I found that's helpful is I try not to have too fatty of a dinner. I still have fat. I'm not avoiding it, but I don't want to go big right before, I go to bed, because that generally what I can see it on the CGM. I'll take a medium acting insulin, and sometime around 2, 3, 4 in the morning, you get that gradual rise, or you go to bed maybe at 90, and by 2 in the morning, you're at 130, because that's fat is hitting, and you don't have the ability to counteract that naturally. So you have to take a correction. But yeah, I'd say my total basal insulin is somewhere around 14 units a day. And then a bolus, probably 3 or 4 units a day. And going back to Dr. Bernstein's book, the injectable rapid acting insulins are so powerful. They're, I think, 12 times stronger than human insulin, that I have to dilute that. So I actually dilute the Novolog in half, and then I use a pen that gives half unit dosing so that I can take a quarter unit at a time. I also use Novolin R, which is the slower, longer acting mid-range insulin, to help with fat and proteins as well, often given at half unit increments, again, because it's just that powerful. And if you're not eating the carbohydrates, it's just not necessary. So I'd say on average, I average about around 20 units total insulin a day, whereas some people who I know that don't do, or that are standard American diet folks, they use insulin pumps, and that's great, but they're sometimes concerned about 300 units lasting them 3 days, which is the average length of an infusion set of a pump. So it's a big difference.
Yeah, and there's, as you may be aware, there are studies that correlate things like cancer with the amount of insulin you're consuming. And so you're using under 20 units a day, which it sounds like, in your weigh 80 kilos. It's a tiny amount, where some people at 80 kilos, like you said, might be consuming 100, 150, 200 units a day. And that puts them in these higher risk categories for things like cancer, which is obviously something you certainly don't want to add to. Right. Let me ask you, shift gears a little bit. Sure. Athletics, because you said you're still active. How has the switch, obviously being a type 1 diabetic throws a new wrinkle into the game, but how has the dietary shift to a less carbohydrate dominant diet affected your athletic performance?
Yeah, there's obviously a shift that occurs where you have to get away from that idea of fueling to eat to fuel, like right here, right now, especially being on the bike. There was a lot of drink mixes and that kind of stuff that you use during races and so on. And like on a 40-mile mountain bike race, I used to go through 300 grams of carbohydrates or 200 grams of carbohydrates, most of which was just maltodextrin. That's kind of garbage. And whereas now I might have a bottle of that stuff on the bike, mainly as a safety precaution. I'm mainly fueling off of some bars, but they're higher protein, higher fat. I'll bring Epic bars with me they're mainly meat, that kind of stuff. Beef jerky. I think you've had them on your show. Robert Sykes, he has Keto Brick. Mm-hmm. I utilize those. Are great products for backpacking, backcountry. I go back fly fishing for 5 days in the backcountry of Montana, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I just don't find that it's as necessary to fuel during your workouts. I do a lot of fasted workouts in the morning. If I had it my way every day, I'd go in the morning, get my workout in. If it's just a workout and not an activity like making a day of it, going hiking or something, in the morning fasted, because I have no problem making it through a workout, an hour and a half workout. And in some cases, as you've also indicated, you get a hard workout out lifting, I may have to take a quarter or a half a unit of insulin just to avoid that excessive rise from the glycogen release that's coming out of your liver and muscle. But yeah, it's just, it simplifies it, to be quite honest, because you just don't have that. You're not throwing pieces of newspaper in the fire. You're just putting a log on, or you have a log on there already, and you're good to go most of the time. And I'm not going to make it sound like it's sunshine and daisies all the time. Sometimes I got to use a correction of some rapid acting carbs. But again, just R.D. Dijkman was talking about, it's, a glucose tab or a sip of something just to stabilize. It's not like, it's rarely a panic.
I just got back. I just flew back from Germany a couple of days ago. I've been traveling a lot. Yeah. Do you eat the airplane food? Because obviously it seems like, to me, like if you're on a long flight, every hour or two, they're bringing some kind of junky snack like potato chips and cookies and things like that. And so what are your thoughts on airplane? Do you bring your own food, or how do you do it on the airplane?
Yeah, I almost always bring my own food. It was a habit actually I got into years ago when I was, flying regional airlines and the pay wasn't what it is now. And it was just a habit even before I got into, current lifestyle. But it removes the whole like, oh, what are they having? Do I need to go in and fight the lines and all that kind of stuff? Not to even bring into the equation the quality of what's in there. So I would say 90% of what I eat on the road is stuff I bring with me. And again, it's just, you can throw some burger patties in there, some bacon, I make egg sandwiches where instead of a bun, there's eggs on both sides of a piece of sausage for the morning. I eat guacamole, that kind of stuff. And I just bring that with me, and then I'm not confined to whatever you can get a hold of, right? Now, for just a test purposes, I have eaten the crew meals at United, and they have a steak option and so on. And it's a piece of steak, but who knows what they're doing to that thing. But I eat that, and I've got to use considerably more insulin than if it was a steak that I made. I stay away from those now, and it's not a slight on the food service sector of the airline. It's just I choose not to. Plus, when you're that sedentary, you're just sitting there flying for 2.5 hours at a time. Anything you eat is going to be markedly more of a result on the CGM. It just is, because you inject insulin under subcutaneously. You don't have the blood flow that you would if you were up walking around. You got to use more insulin, and it's just to say that I don't eat on the airplane is not correct. I certainly don't want to antagonize that phenomenon by eating weird things out of the snack cart. It's not worth it.
Yeah, I literally just don't eat on the plane. And I'll even going to Germany, 10-hour flight. Because I'm sitting there the whole time. I'm not expending much energy. I was in coach on the way back, and I just couldn't even move. I was so crazy.
Yeah.
So it was like I was supposed to get an exit row, and they changed the flight, and they couldn't. So it was a bit of a nightmare. But anyway, okay, let me go back to one other thing, because you mentioned labs. Now you're on a very low carb diet. You are very lean. You said 9% body fat. I would predict you have elevated cholesterol. Is that correct or no?
Yeah, as you have many experts on your show and others have talked about what's elevated, right? Before getting type 1 diabetes, I maybe had my cholesterol checked once every 4 years. It was generally in the upper hundreds, low 200s. But no, right now, I actually just got my 3-month labs pulled this morning. But my last set, my total cholesterol, which again is not really a factor of concern now, is what's being revealed, was 215. So not astronomically high, but I guess high by some people's concern. And a year ago, I had a CAC score done, and it was 7. So again, I'm not going to sit here and just spout, oh, it's 0. That'd be a lie. 7, but I think 7's acceptable. And seeing as how it goes up to what, 12 or 1500? Is that right?
For CAC?
Yeah.
No, I think it can go into the thousands if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, like 1200. But anyway, mine was 7, so 17, not 700. So not bad. HDL was always in the 90s. My triglycerides, since being measured and adopting this way of eating, have never been above 50. My last labs, they were 38 for my triglycerides, which I think is maybe a better indicator of what's actually going on in the liver and so on. No progression or concern. And I do have cardiovascular disease in my family. 2 of my uncles, my mother's brothers, died from cardiovascular complications. My father had a triple bypass in his late 50s. So it's there. It's a concern. It's something I'm very aware of. But from where I'm sitting and the labs that I have to prove it, and the CAC score, this way of eating is nothing but beneficial as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I'm sure that's the case, that if you have active chest pain or significant cardiovascular, you can't fly either, I would assume. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, cardiac conditions are definitely of significant concern. There's been plenty of people who have gone out on disability or medical because of cardiac conditions. There are some that are acceptable, that once you've treated the condition and moved on and have shown that you're safe, you can get your medical back. Some various types of arrhythmias and anginas and things like that, or other cardiovascular issues, particularly ones that can affect the brain as well, those will be lifelong groundings for flying for sure. But yeah, cardiovascular disease in the pilot population, it's the population. It's a significant concern. And it's a problem. And on that note, you're, I think, 10 years older than me or 8 years older than me. But I think our generation is maybe the first that's getting the full brunt of the advent of all these processed foods and kind of the compromised nutrition. No fault of our parents. They didn't know any better. They were doing what they were, recommended to do by doctors. But the reason why I bring this up is in the last year, 3 of my friends that I went to high school with have all died from massive heart attacks. These guys were 45, 44 years old and just out. One of them just died a month and a half ago. And this is bad news. We really have got to turn the ship around if possible, or at least get the information out there so that people can make informed decisions on what do they want to do. You can't force people's hand. I don't get in arguments with people over this kind of stuff, but again, credit to you for trying to get this information at least in people's brain.
Yeah, we're making progress, I think. You said 2.5 hours. Do you have a typical area you fly to? Do you like always fly to the same kind of places, or do you have various routes?
No, they change really, anywhere from a single day trip, because I live in Denver and United has a huge base out of Denver, all the way up to 4-day trips. And the aircraft that I'm on is mostly domestic, but we go up to Canada, down to Mexico and some of the Caribbean and those areas. But yeah, I'd say the average flight length is about anywhere from an hour and a half to the longer ones, the transcons, are 4.5 hours at a time. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a preference? I'm sure with family and stuff, you prefer to be home more, but do you like?
Yeah, I find that I have a 3.5-year-old son. The 3-day trips, I think, are ideal because if you're going to get all your stuff together and head out to the airport, you might as well get at least a couple days in. And they're pretty efficient. So that's my preference, is a 3-day trip. I do 4-day trips as well too, but yeah, that's usually where I focus. And as far as where I go, I prefer some of the mountain airports and stuff. They're just more interesting. They're more challenging. I enjoy them. And the overnights are nice. Jackson Hole, that's a nice overnight. Vancouver, we got a great Vancouver overnight. And some of the Pacific Northwest are great. But yeah, it's get around all over.
Maybe I'll catch you on one of the flights. I fly out of Seattle quite a bit, and I've recently been flying more United just because of the flights to the right places. I'm asked to go all over the place now. So I was doing a lot on Delta and American, but I'm also doing United. So maybe we'll run into each other at some point. We're about out of time, John. I appreciate your input. I learned something new I did not know that pilots can now fly on insulin. So that's something that I think is pretty cool to hear. And obviously with appropriate controls put in place, which makes sense to me. Because you think about it, there's a lot of type 1 diabetics that drive cars. I mean, there's a lot of them, and probably some of them are driving around with pretty poor control, I would imagine. And there's probably car wrecks and things like that. Any last thing you wanted to share before we go?
Yeah, just folks that are hearing this or seeing this, whether they're potentially type 2 or type 1, or maybe looking for some validation just from someone who's used and applied these concepts of nutrition and activity 100%. Able to do this. I've coached some type 2s that have completely reversed the disease simply by nutritional correction or implementation of better practices. And then, anyone who's maybe a pilot or knows maybe a family member that's interested in doing it and that's maybe struggling, especially with type 1, you can go on the Federal Aviation website and just put in ITDM, that's insulin treated diabetes mellitus, ITDM protocol, and they'll give you all the information exactly what you have to do to get those medical if you do want to fly. And myself and over 200 other pilots are out there flying around right now. And as a validation of that, both here and in other countries in Europe that do allow type 1 and insulin treated diabetics, there's not been one instance, not one, of incapacitation in flight, not one. Whereas that can't be said for cardiac or even some of the brain aneurysms and other health issues. But the people who are doing this are very attent to doing it safely, complying with this. There's a lot of oversight to the general public. It's very safe. And I can speak for everyone that I've come in contact with, including myself. If I have one just breath of uncertainty in my current condition, both pertaining to blood glucose or diabetic control or just general health, I'm not going anywhere near that airplane. It's very safe, and it's definitely a career track that's open to all. I've done Others that are friends of mine have done presentations at some of the juvenile diabetes research foundations and so on, and JDRF was formerly known as. And it's exciting for kids. I've seen kids with pumps and seen them walking off the airplane, and I'll hold up my arm and say, "Oh yeah, Dexcom, hey, how's it going?" And they're like, they're just floored. And that's a huge thing, just to give that aspect to folks that are interested in getting into the industry now.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Thanks so much. Take care now.
All right.